The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors where Kate Middleton stood, her hands trembling slightly as she held the sealed envelope. The weight of what she was about to discover pressed against her chest like a stone. She had fought for 3 weeks to gain access to this report, and, now that it was finally in her hands, a part of her wondered if some secrets were better left buried. The previous month had been filled with whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms, meaningful glances exchanged between staff members, and an uncomfortable tension that seemed to follow her daughter Charlotte wherever they went. Something had happened during Charlotte's supervised playtime in the palace gardens, something significant enough to warrant a formal security report, yet nobody would speak of it directly. Kate remembered the day it all began. She had been in her private office, reviewing correspondence from various charitable organizations, when her personal secretary, Miranda, had knocked softly on the door. The woman's usually composed demeanor showed cracks of uncertainty as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her with unusual care. "Your Royal Highness," Miranda had begun, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's been an incident involving Princess Charlotte." "Nothing dangerous," she added quickly, seeing Kate's face pale, "but the head of security has requested a meeting with you at your earliest convenience." Kate had set down her fountain pen, the elegant script of her half-finished letter forgotten. "What kind of incident? Is Charlotte hurt?" "No, ma'am. Princess Charlotte is perfectly safe. She's currently with her tutor in the East Wing. But there are some concerns that have arisen from yesterday's outdoor activities." The way Miranda avoided eye contact sent alarm bells ringing in Kate's mind. In her years as a member of the royal family, she had learned to read the subtle language of palace staff. Miranda's careful word choice and nervous energy suggested something far more complex than a simple playground mishap. Kate had demanded to see Charlotte immediately, rushing through the grand corridors with their portraits of long-dead monarchs watching her pass. She found her daughter in the library, bent over a geography book, her dark hair falling in waves around her face as she traced countries on a map with her finger. Charlotte looked up when her mother entered, and Kate searched her daughter's face for any sign of distress or trauma. "Hello, Mama," Charlotte had said brightly, seemingly unaware of any drama surrounding her. "Did you know that Australia has more sheep than people?" Kate had knelt beside her daughter's chair, studying the child's expression carefully. Charlotte appeared completely normal, perhaps even happier than usual. Her cheeks held a healthy pink flush, her eyes sparkled with their typical curiosity, and she showed no signs of the anxiety or fear that Kate might have expected after a troubling incident. "How was your time in the gardens yesterday, sweetheart?" Kate had asked gently, brushing a strand of hair from Charlotte's forehead. Charlotte's face had lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Oh, it was wonderful. I made a new friend, and we played the most amazing games. We built a fortress out of fallen branches and pretended we were explorers discovering a new land." She knew so many interesting things about plants and animals. "A new friend?" Kate had pressed carefully. "Was this someone from your usual playgroup?" Charlotte had shaken her head, her expression growing slightly confused. "No, she was someone different. She said she lived nearby and often played in the gardens when they were quiet. She had the most beautiful long hair, almost like yours, Mama, but lighter. And she wore the prettiest old-fashioned dress, like something from a fairy tale." Kate's stomach had tightened. The palace gardens were heavily secured, with multiple checkpoints and constant surveillance. No unauthorized person, especially not a child, should have been able to enter the grounds undetected. Yet Charlotte's description was so vivid and detailed that it was impossible to dismiss as imagination. "What did you and your friend talk about?" Kate had asked, trying to keep her voice light despite the growing unease. "Oh, many things," Charlotte had replied, returning her attention to the map. "She told me stories about the palace from long ago, about princesses who lived here before us. She knew all the secret passages and hidden rooms. She even showed me a special place where roses grow in patterns that spell out words." Kate had felt a chill run down her spine. The rose garden Charlotte described was a real location on the palace grounds, but it was in a restricted section that required special access. More disturbing was Charlotte's mention of secret passages, architectural features that were not common knowledge, even among long-term palace residents.
That evening, Kate had met with James Whitmore, the head of palace security.
Whitmore was a stern man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in military service. He had served the royal family faithfully for over 20 years, and Kate had never seen him look as unsettled as he did that night. "Your Royal Highness," Whitmore had begun, his usual formal tone carrying an undercurrent of genuine concern, "we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Yesterday, during Princess Charlotte's supervised outdoor time, our surveillance equipment captured some unusual activity." Kate had leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap.
"What kind of unusual activity?"
Whitmore had hesitated, a rare display of uncertainty from a man known for his directness. "Your Royal Highness, what I'm about to tell you may sound impossible, but I assure you that multiple guards witnessed the same events, and we have video footage to support our observations."
"Please, just tell me what happened."
Princess Charlotte appeared to be playing with another child in the gardens. A young girl, approximately her own age, with long blonde hair and wearing what appeared to be period clothing from perhaps the early 20th century. Kate had felt her breath catch.
Another child? How did an unauthorized person gain access to the grounds?
"That's just it, ma'am.
We have no record of anyone entering or leaving the secured area.
Our checkpoints show no breaches, our motion sensors detected no intrusions, and our guards saw no one approaching the garden section where the princess was playing."
The implications had hit Kate like a physical blow. "Are you suggesting that this child somehow appeared and disappeared without passing through any security measures?"
Whitmore had nodded grimly.
"More than that, Your Royal Highness."
Guard Thompson, who was monitoring the situation from his post, reported that he lost sight of the mysterious child multiple times, only to see her reappear in locations that should have been impossible to reach in such a short time span. Kate had spent the rest of that meeting pressing for details, but Whitmore had been frustratingly vague. He kept referring to the full report that was being compiled, insisting that she would need to review the written documentation and video evidence before any conclusions could be drawn. For 3 weeks, Kate had been met with bureaucratic resistance every time she requested access to this report. Palace officials cited ongoing investigation, security protocols, and need for proper channels. Each delay had only intensified her determination to uncover the truth about what had happened to her daughter in those gardens. Now, finally, holding the sealed envelope, Kate moved to her private sitting room and settled into her favorite armchair by the window. The autumn sun cast a warm glow across the Persian carpet, and she could hear the distant sounds of palace staff going about their daily routines. Everything appeared normal, yet she knew that normalcy was about to be shattered. She broke the wax seal carefully and pulled out a thick folder containing multiple documents. The first page was a standard incident report form, filled out in the precise handwriting she recognized as belonging to Guard Thompson. The man had been with the Royal Protection Detail for 15 years and was known for his attention to detail and unflappable demeanor. The initial summary was brief but disturbing: unexplained presence of unidentified child in secured palace gardens. Subject appeared to interact with Princess Charlotte for approximately 90 minutes. Multiple attempts to approach or identify the individual were unsuccessful due to subject's apparent ability to evade detection. Kate flipped through several pages of technical security data, camera angles, timestamp records, motion sensor readings. The information was dense and difficult to parse, but certain details jumped out at her. According to the sensor data, only one person had been detected in the garden area during the time period in question, Charlotte. Yet the video logs clearly indicated the presence of a second individual. Her hands shook slightly as she reached the section containing Guard Thompson's detailed personal account. Unlike the clinical language of the official forms, Thompson's narrative was written in plain English and conveyed a sense of genuine bewilderment that she had never associated with the composed security officer. At approximately 14:30 hours, Thompson's account began. "I observed Princess Charlotte entering the East Garden area for her scheduled outdoor activity period. She appeared to be in normal spirits, carrying her favorite skipping rope and a small basket for collecting leaves, as per her usual routine." Kate could picture the scene clearly. Charlotte loved her afternoon garden time, often spending hours exploring the various planted areas and observing the wildlife that made their home on the palace grounds. It was one of the few times during her structured day when she was allowed to play freely, albeit under constant but discreet supervision. Thompson's account continued. At 14:45, I noticed the princess engaged in animated conversation near the Heritage Rose Garden. Initially, I assumed she was talking to herself or perhaps to one of the garden cats, as children often do. However, her body language and the responsive nature of her speech patterns suggested she was interacting with another person. Kate felt her pulse quicken. The Heritage Rose Garden was Charlotte's favorite spot, filled with varieties that had been cultivated on the palace grounds for generations. It was also one of the most secure areas, surrounded by high walls and accessible only through a single gated entrance that required special clearance. I adjusted my position to get a clearer view of the princess and observed that she was indeed speaking with another child, a girl who appeared to be of similar age and height. This individual had long, light-colored hair and was wearing what I can only describe as vintage clothing, possibly from the 1920s or 1930s. The dress appeared to be made of fine material, possibly silk or satin, and was in pristine condition despite what should have been outdoor play activity. Kate paused in her reading, trying to process this information. A child in vintage clothing, appearing in one of the most secure areas of the palace grounds without triggering any security protocols. It sounded impossible, yet Thompson's reputation for reliability made it difficult to dismiss. The account became even more puzzling as it continued. I immediately attempted to approach the area to identify the unknown individual and ensure the princess's safety. However, as I moved toward the garden, the second child seemed to anticipate my approach and moved deeper into the rose garden, using the planted areas as cover. Despite my extensive knowledge of the garden layout, I found myself unable to maintain visual contact with the subject.
Kate could imagine Thompson's frustration.
The man prided himself on his professional competence, and the idea that a young child could outmaneuver him in a space he knew intimately must have been deeply unsettling. On 3 separate occasions, I lost sight of the unknown individual entirely, only to observe her reappearing in locations that would have required crossing open ground under direct observation. Each time, Princess Charlotte continued her interactions as if nothing unusual had occurred, suggesting that the subject had not actually left the area but had somehow avoided my detection.
The technical language couldn't disguise Thompson's bewilderment.
Kate had worked with palace security long enough to understand the implications of what he was describing.
The garden area was designed to provide multiple sightlines and minimal hiding places.
For someone to move through it undetected, especially while under active surveillance, should have been virtually impossible. Thompson's account took an even stranger turn. At approximately 15:20, I observed both children engaged in what appeared to be an elaborate game involving the construction of some sort of structure using fallen branches and garden debris. The unknown subject demonstrated familiarity with the garden layout that suggested either extensive previous access or intimate knowledge of the grounds. She led Princess Charlotte to several locations that are not typically included in the standard tour routes, including the old greenhouse foundation and the memorial garden section that has been closed to general access for the past decade. Kate's blood ran cold. The memorial garden was a small, secluded area dedicated to palace staff members who had died in service to the royal family. It had been sealed off years ago due to structural concerns with some of the older monuments, and access required special authorization that was rarely granted. The idea that an unknown child not only knew of its existence but could lead Charlotte there was deeply troubling.
The report continued with increasingly bizarre details. Thompson described watching the 2 children playing games that seemed to involve intimate knowledge of palace history and architecture.
The unknown girl had apparently shown Charlotte several secret passages that Thompson himself was unaware of, despite his years of security training that included comprehensive building layouts. Most disturbing, Thompson wrote, was the conversation I overheard when I managed to position myself within listening range at approximately 15:45. The unknown subject was telling Princess Charlotte detailed stories about previous royal children who had lived in the palace, including specific anecdotes about their daily lives, favorite games, and personal relationships. The level of historical detail was remarkable for a child of her apparent age, and many of the facts she shared are not part of the public record or standard palace tour information. Kate felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air drifting through the window. The palace archives contained extensive records of royal family life throughout the centuries, but much of that information was restricted access, available only to historians and researchers with special clearance.
How could a random child, who had somehow infiltrated the most secure grounds in Britain, possess such detailed knowledge?
Thomson's account reached its climax with a description that made Kate's hands tremble as she read. At 1600 hours, as Princess Charlotte's outdoor time was scheduled to end, I approached the garden area to escort her back to the palace. As I entered the rose garden, I observed Princess Charlotte standing alone near the central fountain, waving goodbye to someone I could not see. When I asked her about her companion, the princess pointed toward the old oak tree near the garden's north wall and said she had to go home now, but she promised to visit again soon. Kate set down the papers for a moment, her mind racing. Charlotte had been saying goodbye to someone who was apparently invisible to adult observation. Either her daughter had an incredibly vivid imagination, or something far more unsettling was occurring on the palace grounds. Thomson's final paragraphs contained the most disturbing details of all. Upon escorting Princess Charlotte back to the palace, I conducted a thorough search of the garden area with 2 additional guards. We found evidence of recent activity, disturbed earth around the constructed fort, freshly picked flowers arranged in patterns, and small footprints in the soft soil near the fountain. Significantly, there were 2 distinct sets of footprints, one clearly belonging to Princess Charlotte and another of similar size but with a different shoe pattern. Kate felt her heart racing. Physical evidence of another child's presence, yet no record of anyone entering or leaving the secured area. The logical explanations were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Most troubling of all, Thomson concluded, was the discovery of a small posy of flowers placed on the memorial stone in the restricted garden area. The flowers were varieties that do not currently bloom on the palace grounds, and the arrangement style was consistent with Victorian mourning customs. The memorial stone in question commemorates Lady Margaret Ashworth, a governess who served the royal family in the 1920s and died tragically in 1929 at the age of 26.
Kate's breath caught in her throat.
She was familiar with Lady Margaret's story, a young woman who had been beloved by the royal children of her era but who had died in a mysterious accident while walking in the palace gardens. The details of her death had always been somewhat vague in the official records, but Kate remembered reading that she had been found near the old oak tree, the same location where Charlotte had been waving goodbye to her invisible friend.
The coincidences were becoming too numerous and too specific to dismiss.
As Kate stared out the window at the garden where these events had occurred, she found herself facing a possibility that challenged everything she thought she knew about the world.
Could Charlotte have encountered something supernatural? Was the spirit of a long-dead governess somehow making contact with her daughter?
The rational part of Kate's mind rebelled against such thoughts. She was an educated woman, a member of the modern royal family who prided herself on practical thinking and evidence-based decision-making.
Ghost stories and supernatural encounters were the stuff of folklore and entertainment, not reality.
Yet the evidence in Thomson's report was difficult to explain through conventional means. Multiple witnesses, physical evidence, security footage that recorded impossible events, and Charlotte's own detailed descriptions of interactions that seemed to demonstrate knowledge no child her age should possess. Kate realized that reading this report had only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. She needed to speak with Guard Thomson directly, to hear his account in person and ask the questions that the written report left unanswered. More importantly, she needed to understand what this meant for Charlotte's safety and well-being. As she gathered the papers to return them to their folder, one final detail caught her eye.
Attached to the back of Thomson's report was a small photograph, apparently taken with his mobile phone.
The image showed the memorial stone Thomson had mentioned, with its small floral arrangement placed precisely at its base. But it was the background of the photograph that made Kate's blood freeze. Standing just at the edge of the frame, barely visible among the shadows cast by the old oak tree, was the unmistakable silhouette of a young girl in an old-fashioned dress. The figure was translucent, as if she existed somewhere between the physical world and something else entirely, but her presence in the photograph was undeniable. Kate stared at the image until her eyes watered, trying to convince herself that she was seeing shadows and tricks of light. But the more she looked, the clearer the figure became. The girl appeared to be looking directly toward the camera, and, though her features were indistinct, there was something about her posture that suggested awareness, intelligence, and perhaps even a gentle sadness. For the first time since this strange saga had begun, Kate felt genuinely frightened. Not for Charlotte's physical safety, but for the implications of what was happening. If her daughter was indeed making contact with some kind of supernatural presence, what did that mean for her development, her future, and her role within the royal family? As the afternoon light began to fade, Kate made a decision. She would speak with Thompson immediately, review any additional evidence he might have, and then determine the best course of action. Whatever was happening in those gardens, whatever presence had taken such an interest in her daughter, she was determined to understand it fully. The thought of Charlotte's bright smile when she spoke of her new friend provided some comfort, but it also raised troubling questions. How long had these encounters been occurring? Were there other incidents that had gone unreported? And, most importantly, what did this mysterious presence want with her daughter? Kate stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where Charlotte spent her afternoons playing. The rose bushes were beginning their autumn transition, their blooms fading as the season changed. Somewhere among those carefully tended paths and hidden corners, something extraordinary was happening, something that challenged the very foundations of reality as she understood it. The report in her hands represented only the beginning of what she suspected would be a much larger and more complex mystery. As she prepared to take the next steps in her investigation, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that her family's life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The palace, with its centuries of history and countless untold stories, suddenly felt less like a home and more like a place where the past and present existed in ways that defied conventional understanding. And, at the center of it all was Charlotte, her innocent daughter, who seemed to have become a bridge between worlds that should never have touched. Kate tucked the report under her arm and headed toward the door, determined to find answers to questions she had never thought to ask. The truth, whatever it might be, was waiting somewhere in those gardens, and she would not rest until she understood exactly what was happening to her child. Kate found Guard Thompson in the security office located in the palace's lower level, a windowless room filled with monitors displaying feeds from cameras positioned throughout the grounds. The familiar hum of electronic equipment and the soft glow of screens created an atmosphere of constant vigilance that had always made Kate slightly uncomfortable. Today, however, she was grateful for the thoroughness of the surveillance system that might hold answers to the mysteries surrounding her daughter. Thompson stood when she entered, his usual professional composure intact, though Kate noticed the subtle signs of stress in the tight lines around his eyes and the way his fingers drummed nervously against the desk. She had worked with him long enough to recognize when something had genuinely unsettled the typically unflappable security officer. "Your Royal Highness," Thompson said, offering a slight bow. "I understand you've reviewed my preliminary report. I must say, ma'am, that in 15 years of Royal Protection Service, I've never encountered anything quite like the events of that afternoon." Kate settled into the chair across from his desk, the folder containing his report still clutched in her hands. "I need to understand exactly what you saw, Mr. Thompson. Your written account is thorough, but there are details I need clarified. Most importantly, I need to know if Princess Charlotte is in any danger." Thompson's expression softened slightly, revealing the genuine concern beneath his professional exterior. "From what I observed, ma'am, the princess appeared completely at ease throughout the entire encounter. Whatever this presence is, it seemed to have only benevolent intentions toward her. But, I won't lie to you, the implications of what happened that day challenge everything I thought I knew about palace security." "Show me the video footage," Kate said decisively. "I need to see these events for myself." Thompson nodded and turned to his computer, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. "I should warn you, Your Royal Highness, that the footage is unusual. Our technical team has analyzed it extensively, and they've confirmed that the recordings haven't been tampered with, but what they show defies conventional explanation." The main monitor flickered to life, displaying a bird's-eye view of the Heritage Rose Garden. Kate could see Charlotte clearly, skipping along the garden path with her characteristic enthusiasm. The timestamp showed 14:32, just a few minutes after Charlotte had entered the garden area. "Watch carefully," Thompson said, adjusting the playback controls. "At 14:44, you'll see the first anomaly." Kate leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen. Charlotte appeared to pause in her skipping and turn toward something off-camera. Her body language immediately changed from solitary play to interactive conversation, her head tilting in a listening posture, her hands gesturing animatedly as if responding to questions or comments. She's clearly talking to someone, Kate murmured, but there's no one there. Keep watching, Thompson replied grimly. As the footage continued, Kate observed her daughter's behavior becoming increasingly social. Charlotte began moving around the garden in a pattern that suggested she was following someone else's lead, pausing at specific locations and appearing to listen to explanations or stories. Her facial expression showed delight, surprise, and curiosity, exactly the reactions Kate would expect from Charlotte when meeting a new playmate. At 14:52, Thompson continued, "Watch the area near the central fountain." Kate's breath caught as she saw what appeared to be a brief visual distortion in the air near where Charlotte was standing. It was subtle, like heat shimmer on a hot day, but there was no sun strong enough to create such an effect. Within that shimmer, for just a few frames, the outline of a human figure seemed to materialize before dissolving back into transparency. "Did you see that?" Thompson asked. I'm not sure what I saw," Kate replied, though her heart was racing. "Can you play that section again?" Thompson rewound the footage and played it in slow motion. This time, the distortion was more clearly visible, and Kate could make out what appeared to be the shape of a child in old-fashioned clothing. The figure was translucent, existing somewhere between visibility and complete transparency. "Our technical team has analyzed this section frame by frame," Thompson explained. "They've confirmed that the visual distortion is present in the original recording and wasn't added through digital manipulation. Whatever caused this effect was physically present in the garden at the time of recording." Kate watched in fascination and growing unease as the footage continued. Charlotte moved through the garden with purpose, occasionally pausing to pick flowers or examine plants. But her movements weren't random, they followed a clear pattern, as if she were being guided on a tour of the grounds. "This is where it gets truly unusual," Thompson said, advancing the footage to 15:15. "Watch Princess Charlotte's behavior near the restricted Memorial Garden area." On screen, Charlotte approached the gated entrance to the Memorial Garden, a section that had been closed to general access for years. Kate watched in amazement as her daughter walked directly to the gate and appeared to manipulate the latch, despite the fact that it should have been locked. The gate was secured with a combination lock, Thompson explained. Princess Charlotte shouldn't have known the code, and even if she had, she wouldn't have been tall enough to reach the mechanism properly. Yet the footage clearly showed Charlotte opening the gate with ease and entering the restricted area. She moved through the Memorial Garden with confidence, navigating around overgrown plants and weathered monuments as if she had been there many times before. "Who else has access to that area?" Kate asked, her voice tight with concern. "Currently, only senior maintenance staff and myself," Thompson replied. "The combination is changed quarterly, and we keep detailed logs of every entry. There's no record of Princess Charlotte or any unauthorized person accessing that section in over 2 years." Kate watched as Charlotte moved through the Memorial Garden, eventually stopping at a particular headstone. Even from the aerial camera angle, Kate could see her daughter's demeanor become more solemn, as if she understood the significance of where she was standing. "That's Lady Margaret Ashworth's memorial," Thompson noted quietly. "The governess I mentioned in my report." Charlotte knelt beside the memorial stone and appeared to be listening intently to something or someone. After several minutes, she carefully arranged a small bouquet of flowers at the base of the memorial, then stood and curtsied, a formal gesture that Kate had never taught her daughter but which would have been appropriate etiquette from the 1920s era. Where did she learn to curtsy like that? Kate whispered, more to herself than to Thompson. The footage continued for another 30 minutes, showing Charlotte and her invisible companion playing elaborate games throughout the garden. They appeared to be engaged in hide-and-seek, exploring various sections of the grounds, and even constructing the makeshift fort that Thompson had described in his report. What struck Kate most forcefully was Charlotte's obvious joy throughout the entire encounter. Her daughter's laughter was audible through the audio system, and her facial expression showed pure delight. Whatever was happening, Charlotte was enjoying herself immensely. "At 1600 hours, Thompson said, you'll see the conclusion of the encounter." Kate watched as Charlotte gathered her belongings and began walking toward the garden exit. But, just before leaving, she turned back and waved enthusiastically toward the old oak tree near the memorial garden. Her lips moved in what appeared to be words of farewell, and she remained in that position for nearly a full minute, as if listening to final comments from her invisible friend. As Charlotte finally left the garden area, the camera captured one final anomaly. Near the oak tree where Charlotte had been waving, the same heat shimmer distortion appeared again, but this time it held its form long enough for Kate to see clear details. The figure of a young girl in 1920s clothing became visible for nearly 10 seconds before gradually fading away. The girl appeared to be waving goodbye in return, and, even through the grainy security footage, Kate could see that she was smiling. Her long, light-colored hair moved in a breeze that didn't seem to affect the surrounding vegetation, and her old-fashioned dress appeared to shimmer with its own inner light. Thompson paused the footage at the moment when the figure was most clearly visible. "This is the clearest image we have of the presence. Our technical team has enhanced it as much as possible while maintaining the integrity of the original recording." Kate stared at the frozen image, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The girl appeared to be about Charlotte's age, with delicate features and an expression of gentle kindness. Despite the old-fashioned clothing and the supernatural nature of her presence, there was nothing threatening about her appearance. "Have you researched Lady Margaret Ashworth?" Kate asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Thompson nodded and pulled out another folder from his desk drawer. "Extensively, ma'am. Lady Margaret was hired as a governess to the royal children in 1925. She was 22 years old, had excellent credentials from Oxford, and was described by all accounts as exceptionally gifted with children. The royal family of that era adored her." He opened the folder and showed Kate a formal portrait photograph from the 1920s. Kate's breath caught in her throat. The young woman in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to the figure captured in the security footage, the same delicate features, the same long, light-colored hair, the same gentle expression. Lady Margaret worked for the royal family for 4 years, Thompson continued. During that time, she became particularly close to Princess Mary, who was about Charlotte's current age. According to the historical records, she introduced innovative teaching methods and was known for her creative approach to education. She often took the children on elaborate adventure games throughout the palace grounds, teaching them history and natural science through play. Kate felt a chill of recognition. Charlotte's description of her new friend who knew so many interesting things about plants and animals suddenly took on new significance. "What happened to her?" Kate asked, though she dreaded the answer. Thompson's expression grew somber. In September of 1929, Lady Margaret was found dead in the palace gardens near the old oak tree. The official cause of death was listed as a tragic accident. Apparently she had fallen and struck her head on a stone. But there were some unusual circumstances surrounding her death that were never fully explained. What kind of unusual circumstances? According to the witness statements from that time, Lady Margaret had been seen in the gardens that evening playing with one of the royal children. But, when her body was discovered the next morning, no child was found, and all the royal children were accounted for in their beds, apparently having been there all night. Kate felt the pieces of a disturbing puzzle beginning to fall into place. "Are you suggesting that Lady Margaret died while in the company of a child who was never identified?" "The records are unclear," Thompson admitted. There was some speculation at the time that she might have been meeting someone in secret, but Lady Margaret was known for her impeccable character and devotion to her duties. The idea of her engaging in any kind of clandestine activity was dismissed by everyone who knew her. Kate studied the historical photograph more carefully. Lady Margaret had the kind of face that inspired immediate trust, open, intelligent, and radiating genuine warmth. Looking at her image, Kate could easily understand why the royal children of her era had loved her so deeply. "There's more," Thompson continued, pulling out additional documents. In the weeks following Lady Margaret's death, several members of the household staff reported unusual occurrences in the palace gardens. Sounds of children playing when no children were present, the appearance of flowers arranged in patterns that matched Lady Margaret's teaching methods, and glimpses of a figure in old-fashioned clothing walking the garden paths. "Ghost stories," Kate said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps. But what makes this relevant to our current situation is that these reports continued sporadically for decades. Every few years, usually when young children were staying at the palace, staff members would report similar phenomena. A presence in the gardens, evidence of someone playing with the children, and sightings of a figure matching Lady Margaret's description. Thompson opened another file and spread out a collection of incident reports spanning nearly a century. Kate scanned the dates and descriptions with growing amazement.
1934, 1941, 1956, 1963, 1978, 1985, 1999, 2007, 2018, each report described remarkably similar events to what Charlotte had experienced.
Why wasn't I told about this pattern before?
Kate asked, feeling a mixture of anger and bewilderment.
Honestly, ma'am, most of us assumed these were isolated incidents, easily explained by overactive imaginations or misidentification of normal occurrences.
It wasn't until I began researching Princess Charlotte's encounter that the historical pattern became apparent. Kate read through several of the historical reports, noting the consistent details across decades of sightings.
The mysterious figure always appeared to children between the ages of 6 and 10.
She was invariably described as kind and educational, teaching the children about history, nature, and palace traditions. The encounters always occurred in the gardens during daylight hours, and the children involved always spoke positively about their experiences.
What's particularly interesting, Thompson added, is that the children who had these encounters often went on to show exceptional academic performance and strong interests in history and natural sciences. Several became notable scholars or conservationists in their adult lives.
Kate thought about Charlotte's recent enthusiasm for geography and her newfound interest in historical stories.
Could these changes in her daughter's intellectual development be connected to her mysterious garden encounters?
There's one more thing, Thompson said, his voice dropping to a near whisper.
I'd been doing some research into Lady Margaret's personal history.
It turns out she never had children of her own, despite being engaged to be married at the time of her death. Her fiancé was killed in World War I, and she devoted herself entirely to caring for and educating other people's children.
The implication hit Kate like a physical blow.
If the presence in the gardens was indeed Lady Margaret's spirit, perhaps she was continuing the work she had loved most in life, nurturing and teaching young minds. The idea that a governess who had died tragically nearly a century ago might still be watching over royal children was both touching and terrifying.
What do we do about this?
Kate asked, realizing that she had unconsciously shifted from skepticism to acceptance of the supernatural explanation.
That's a decision only you can make, ma'am, Thompson replied carefully.
From a security standpoint, I see no immediate threat to Princess Charlotte.
Whatever this presence is, it appears to be benevolent and educational.
But, from a family perspective, this raises questions that are well beyond my area of expertise.
Kate stood and walked to the bank of monitors showing various views of the palace grounds.
The gardens looked peaceful and normal in the afternoon light, giving no hint of the extraordinary events that had occurred there. She thought about Charlotte's happiness after her garden encounters, her increased curiosity about learning, and her excitement when talking about her new friend. I want to speak with Charlotte directly about this, Kate decided. But I need to approach it carefully. I don't want to frighten her or make her feel that she's done something wrong.
Of course, ma'am. How would you like me to proceed with the security protocols? Should we restrict Princess Charlotte's access to the garden areas? Kate considered this question carefully.
Every instinct as a mother told her to protect her child from anything unknown or potentially dangerous. But Charlotte's obvious happiness and the historical pattern of positive outcomes gave her pause. If Lady Margaret's spirit was indeed present in the gardens, she had spent nearly a century caring for and educating royal children without causing any harm. Not yet, Kate said finally. But I want enhanced surveillance during Charlotte's garden time. Multiple camera angles, audio recording, and at least 2 guards monitoring at all times. If this presence is truly benevolent, restricting Charlotte's access might cause more distress than allowing the encounters to continue under careful observation.
Thompson nodded approvingly. A reasonable approach, ma'am.
I'll also continue researching the historical records to see if we can learn more about Lady Margaret's methods and intentions. As Kate prepared to leave the security office, one final thought occurred to her.
Mr. Thompson, in your professional opinion, do you believe we're dealing with a genuine supernatural phenomenon?
Thompson was quiet for a long moment, considering his response carefully.
Ma'am, I've spent my entire career dealing with facts, evidence, and logical explanations. 6 months ago, I would have dismissed this entire situation as impossible.
But the evidence is overwhelming and consistent.
Whatever is happening in those gardens challenges our understanding of reality, but it's undeniably real. Kate thanked Thompson and made her way back through the palace corridors, her mind churning with questions and possibilities. The rational part of her mind still rebelled against accepting a supernatural explanation, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. As she walked past the portraits of long-dead royals that lined the palace walls, Kate found herself wondering how many other mysteries and secrets were hidden within these ancient stones. The palace had been home to centuries of human drama, joy, tragedy, and love. Perhaps it wasn't so surprising that some of those powerful emotions might linger beyond the grave. The thought of speaking with Charlotte about her garden encounters both excited and terrified Kate. How did one explain to a 7-year-old that her playmate might be the spirit of a governess who had died before her grandmother was born? More importantly, how did one determine whether such encounters should be encouraged or discouraged? Kate realized that she was entering uncharted territory, both as a mother and as a member of the royal family. There were no protocols for dealing with friendly ghosts, no historical precedents for managing supernatural encounters involving royal children. She would have to trust her instincts and hope that her decisions would protect Charlotte while honoring whatever presence had chosen to make itself known. As she reached her private apartments, Kate made a mental note to research Lady Margaret Ashworth more thoroughly. If Charlotte was going to continue these encounters, Kate wanted to understand exactly who this mysterious presence had been in life. The more she learned about Lady Margaret, the better equipped she would be to determine what was best for her daughter. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. Somewhere in those gardens, Kate knew, extraordinary events were unfolding that challenged everything she thought she understood about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate process of exploring this mystery more deeply, starting with a conversation with Charlotte that would change both their lives forever. The next morning arrived with unusual quietness in the palace, as if the very walls were holding their breath in anticipation of the conversation Kate knew she had to have with Charlotte. She had spent most of the night researching Lady Margaret Ashworth, poring over historical documents that painted a picture of a remarkable young woman whose life had been cut tragically short. Kate discovered that Lady Margaret had been more than just a governess. She had been a pioneering educator who believed in experiential learning long before such methods became fashionable. Her personal journals, preserved in the palace archives, revealed a woman of extraordinary intelligence and creativity who had developed innovative ways to teach children about history, science, and literature through games and adventures. One particular journal entry had struck Kate deeply. "I believe that children learn best when they feel they are discovering knowledge for themselves rather than having it imposed upon them." The palace grounds provide an endless classroom where every flower, every stone, every tree has a story to tell. My greatest joy is watching young minds come alive with curiosity and wonder. Reading those words, Kate began to understand why Lady Margaret's presence might still be felt in the gardens nearly a century after her death. If her spirit somehow lingered, it made perfect sense that she would continue doing what she had loved most, teaching and nurturing children through the natural world around them. Kate found Charlotte in the morning room, sitting at the small table by the window where she typically ate breakfast. Her daughter was spreading jam on toast with characteristic concentration, her dark hair still slightly tousled from sleep. The morning light streaming through the tall windows made Charlotte look almost ethereal, and Kate felt a pang of protectiveness mixed with determination. "Good morning, sweetheart," Kate said, settling into the chair across from Charlotte. "Did you sleep well?" Charlotte looked up with bright eyes and nodded enthusiastically. "Very well, Mama. I had the most wonderful dreams about gardens and adventures. Do you think I could spend extra time in the rose garden today? I have so many new games I want to play." Kate's pulse quickened. Charlotte's eagerness to return to the gardens suggested that her encounters with the mysterious presence were ongoing and positive. Rather than showing any signs of fear or confusion, Charlotte seemed more vibrant and curious than ever. "Before we talk about garden time," Kate said carefully, "I wanted to ask you about your new friend. The one you mentioned playing with in the gardens." Charlotte's face lit up with genuine delight. "Oh, Mama, she's absolutely wonderful. She knows so many fascinating things about the palace and the gardens. Yesterday she showed me where the oldest roses grow, and she told me stories about princesses who lived here long before us." Kate leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice gentle and encouraging. "What's your friend's name, Charlotte?" "She told me to call her Miss Margaret," Charlotte replied matter-of-factly. "She said that's what all her special students called her. She's been teaching children for a very long time, you know. She's incredibly clever." Kate felt her breath catch. Charlotte had never been told about Lady Margaret Ashworth, yet she had somehow learned the governess's name and even details about her role as a teacher. The implications were both fascinating and unsettling. "Can you tell me more about Miss Margaret?" Kate asked. "What does she look like?" Charlotte set down her toast and clasped her hands together, her expression becoming dreamy and thoughtful. "She's very pretty, Mama. She has long golden hair that moves like silk when she walks, and she wears the most beautiful dresses with lots of buttons and lace. They look like something from a fairy tale, but she says they're just regular clothes from when she was young." The description matched perfectly with the historical photographs Kate had studied, but Charlotte was providing details that weren't visible in the formal portraits, details about movement, texture, and personal mannerisms that could only come from direct observation. "Miss Margaret is very kind," Charlotte continued, "but also very proper. She teaches me to curtsy correctly and to speak clearly when I'm reciting poetry. She says good posture is important for young ladies, and she shows me how to walk gracefully even when we're climbing over rocks or exploring hidden places." Kate marveled at the consistency of Charlotte's account with Lady Margaret's historical role as an etiquette instructor as well as an academic teacher. The supernatural presence seemed to be maintaining the same educational philosophy and methods she had employed in life. "What kind of games do you play with Miss Margaret?" Kate asked. "Oh, such exciting games!" Charlotte exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "We play something called historical detectives where we explore different parts of the garden and she tells me stories about the people who used to live here. Then, I have to find clues and solve mysteries about what happened to them." Kate felt a chill of recognition. Lady Margaret's journals had described similar educational games she had developed for the royal children of the 1920s. Charlotte was apparently experiencing teaching methods that had been revolutionary nearly a century ago. "Yesterday," Charlotte continued, "we investigated the old greenhouse foundations, and Miss Margaret told me about a princess who grew exotic orchids there in the 1800s. She showed me where the heating pipes used to run underground, and we found pieces of old flower pots that proved her story was true." The level of historical detail in Charlotte's account was remarkable. Kate made a mental note to verify the story about the orchid-growing princess, though she suspected it would prove to be historically accurate. "We also play Nature's Classroom," Charlotte went on, "where Miss Margaret teaches me about different plants and animals by having me observe them carefully and ask questions. She knows which flowers attract which butterflies, and she can identify bird calls just by listening. She says the natural world is the best teacher if you know how to pay attention." Kate was struck by the educational value of these supernatural encounters. Rather than being frightened or confused by her experiences, Charlotte was receiving what amounted to a personalized, advanced curriculum in history, natural science, and critical thinking skills. "Does Miss Margaret ever talk about herself?" Kate asked carefully. "About where she comes from or why she's in the gardens?" Charlotte's expression became more thoughtful and slightly sad. "Sometimes she looks wistful when we pass certain places in the garden. She told me she used to work here long ago, teaching children like me. She said she loved her job more than anything in the world, and even though she had to go away, she never really wanted to leave." The innocence with which Charlotte described what was essentially a ghost's explanation of her continued earthly presence was both touching and eerie. Lady Margaret seemed to be communicating her story in terms a 7-year-old could understand and accept. "She also said," Charlotte continued, "that sometimes special children come along who remind her of students she used to have. She said I have a curious mind and a kind heart, just like her favorite pupils from the old days." Kate felt a mixture of pride and concern. If Lady Margaret's spirit was indeed present,
she had apparently chosen Charlotte for specific qualities that resonated with her experiences as a governess. The question was whether such attention from a supernatural presence was beneficial or potentially harmful.
"How do you feel when you're with Miss Margaret?"
Kate asked, studying Charlotte's face carefully for any signs of distress or confusion. Charlotte's response was immediate and enthusiastic.
"Happy. So happy, Mama. She makes everything seem more interesting and magical.
When I'm with her, I feel like I'm the smartest, bravest girl in the world.
She believes I can learn anything and do anything if I put my mind to it." Kate's maternal instincts were conflicted.
On one hand, Charlotte's confidence and enthusiasm for learning had clearly benefited from these encounters. On the other hand, the situation challenged everything Kate thought she knew about reality and raised questions about the long-term implications of supernatural contact.
"Charlotte," Kate said gently, "has Miss Margaret ever asked you to keep secrets about your time together?"
Charlotte shook her head immediately.
"Oh no, Mama. She says secrets between children and adults are usually not good things.
She told me I should always tell you about our adventures because she knows you love me and want what's best for me. She actually asked me to tell you that she hopes to meet you someday." Kate felt a jolt of surprise. The idea that Lady Margaret's spirit wanted to communicate with her directly was both intriguing and terrifying.
What would such an encounter involve? How did one have a conversation with a ghost?
Miss Margaret said something else interesting, Charlotte continued, seemingly unaware of her mother's internal turmoil.
"She said that some people might not understand our friendship because they can't see her the way I can. She explained that children often notice things that adults miss because grown-ups sometimes stop believing in wonderful possibilities." The sophistication of this explanation impressed Kate.
Lady Margaret seemed to be preparing Charlotte for the possibility that others might question or doubt her experiences, while simultaneously providing a framework for understanding why such skepticism might occur.
"What did you think about what Miss Margaret said?" Kate asked.
Charlotte considered the question seriously.
"I think she's probably right. Adults do seem to miss lots of interesting things sometimes. But I don't think you would miss wonderful possibilities, Mama. You're different from other grown-ups. You still believe in magic and adventure."
Kate felt her heart swell with love for her daughter's faith in her, even as she grappled with the complexity of the situation. Charlotte's trust that her mother would understand and accept even the most extraordinary circumstances was both a gift and a responsibility.
"Charlotte," Kate said carefully, "would you like me to come to the garden with you sometime when you're playing with Miss Margaret? I'd very much like to meet your friend." Charlotte's face lit up with pure joy. "Oh yes, Mama. That would be absolutely wonderful. I think Miss Margaret would like that very much too.
She's told me so many lovely things about you, and I know she's been hoping you would want to meet her."
Kate felt another chill. If Lady Margaret had been discussing her with Charlotte, what kind of information had been shared? How much did this supernatural presence know about Kate's life and family? "What has Miss Margaret told you about me?"
Kate asked, trying to keep her voice light and curious rather than concerned.
"She said you're a wonderful mother who cares deeply about my education and happiness," Charlotte replied. "She also said you're very brave and intelligent, and that you have the kind of heart that puts family above everything else. She admires how you've adapted to royal life while staying true to yourself." Kate was startled by the accuracy and insight of these observations.
They described aspects of her character and experience that wouldn't be apparent to a casual observer, yet somehow Lady Margaret's spirit seemed to have developed a sophisticated understanding of Kate's personality and values.
"She also said," Charlotte continued, "that she thinks we're very lucky to have each other, and that the bond between a mother and daughter is one of the most powerful forces in the world. She seemed a bit sad when she said that, though. I think she misses her own family." Kate's research the previous night had revealed that Lady Margaret had been an orphan who had never known her parents. Her attachment to the royal children she taught had likely filled a deep emotional need for family connection. The idea that she might still be seeking that connection from beyond the grave was both heartbreaking and compelling. "When would you like me to come to the garden with you?" Kate asked, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable.
Today!" Charlotte exclaimed immediately. "Miss Margaret usually comes to see me during my afternoon garden time. She said yesterday that she sensed you were curious about our friendship and that she would welcome the chance to show you some of the wonderful things we've discovered together." Kate felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. Within a few hours, she would potentially be face to face with a supernatural presence that had been interacting with her daughter. The rational part of her mind still rebelled against the possibility, but the evidence was too compelling to ignore. "All right," Kate agreed. "This afternoon, we'll go to the garden together." Charlotte clapped her hands in delight and immediately began chattering about all the places she wanted to show her mother and the games she thought Miss Margaret might teach them both. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Kate found herself looking forward to the encounter despite her underlying nervousness. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine activities, but Kate found it difficult to concentrate on anything other than the upcoming garden visit. She reviewed Guard Thompson's security footage again, studied the historical photographs of Lady Margaret, and tried to prepare herself mentally for what might occur. Shortly after lunch, Kate and Charlotte made their way to the Heritage Rose Garden. The autumn sun cast long shadows between the carefully maintained flower beds, and the air carried the mixed scents of late-blooming roses and decomposing leaves. The garden appeared completely normal, giving no hint of the extraordinary events that regularly occurred there. Charlotte skipped ahead eagerly, clearly excited about introducing her mother to her mysterious friend. Kate followed more cautiously, her senses heightened and alert for any unusual phenomena. The surveillance cameras that Thompson had positioned were discreetly hidden but provided comprehensive coverage of the area. "Miss Margaret?" Charlotte called out as they entered the central garden area. "I've brought Mama to meet you, just as we discussed. She's very excited to see you too." Kate held her breath, scanning the garden for any sign of the supernatural presence. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant hum of palace activity. Charlotte seemed unconcerned by the apparent absence of her friend. She began exploring the garden with her usual enthusiasm, pointing out various plants and flowers to Kate while maintaining a running commentary directed toward someone who wasn't visible. "Miss Margaret is a bit shy today," Charlotte explained to Kate matter-of-factly. "She says she's nervous about meeting you because it's been such a long time since she's talked to another adult. But she's definitely here, she's just gathering her courage." Kate felt a strange mixture of skepticism and belief. Part of her wondered if Charlotte was simply engaged in elaborate imaginative play, while another part remained open to the possibility that something genuinely supernatural was occurring. As they moved deeper into the garden, Kate began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere. The air seemed to grow slightly cooler, and she became aware of a sense of being watched, though she could see no one else in the area. The feeling wasn't threatening, but rather curious and cautiously hopeful. Charlotte suddenly stopped walking and turned toward a section of the garden near the old oak tree. Her face broke into a radiant smile, and she waved enthusiastically at something Kate couldn't see. "She's here now, Mama," Charlotte announced joyfully. "Miss Margaret is standing right there by the oak tree. She's wearing her blue dress today, the one with the pearl buttons. She's smiling at you and she says she's very pleased to finally meet you." Kate looked in the direction Charlotte was indicating but saw only the ancient oak tree and the play of shadows beneath its branches. Yet as she stared at that spot, she began to perceive a subtle distortion in the air, similar to what she had observed in the security footage. The distortion gradually became more defined, and Kate found herself holding her breath as the faint outline of a human figure began to materialize. The shape was translucent and wavering, like looking through water, but unmistakably present. As Kate watched in amazement, the figure of a young woman in 1920s clothing became increasingly visible. She had long, golden hair arranged in the fashion of her era, and she wore an elegant blue dress with intricate details that spoke of fine craftsmanship. Her face was kind and intelligent, with eyes that seemed to sparkle with warmth and gentle humor. The apparition of Lady Margaret Ashworth stood beneath the oak tree where she had died nearly a century ago, smiling at Kate with an expression of genuine pleasure and, perhaps, relief. For the first time in her adult life, Kate was face to face with something that challenged every assumption she had ever made about the nature of reality. Lady Margaret appeared to be trying to communicate, her lips moving in words that Kate couldn't quite hear. But, somehow, perhaps through intuition or some form of supernatural communication, Kate began to understand the essence of what the ghostly governess was trying to convey.
Welcome. Thank you for trusting me with Charlotte. I mean no harm. I only want to help.
Kate felt tears spring to her eyes as the full reality of the situation hit her. Her daughter had indeed been playing with the spirit of a woman who had died before Kate's own grandparents were born, and that spirit had been providing Charlotte with an extraordinary education rooted in love, wisdom, and centuries of experience. The question now was what to do with this impossible, wonderful, terrifying knowledge. Standing in the shadow of the ancient oak tree, Kate felt the world shift around her as she came face to face with Lady Margaret Ashworth's spirit. The ghostly figure maintained her gentle smile, her translucent form shimmering like silk in the afternoon light. Kate's rational mind struggled to process what she was experiencing, but her maternal instincts recognized something far more important. This presence, whatever it was, radiated love and protection for Charlotte.
Can you hear her, Mama?
Charlotte asked excitedly, bouncing on her toes as she looked between Kate and the apparition. Miss Margaret is saying how honored she is to meet you properly. She says you have beautiful eyes, just like Charlotte described. Kate found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. I can see her, Charlotte.
But I'm having trouble hearing what she's saying.
Lady Margaret's expression showed understanding and compassion. She gestured gracefully toward a small stone bench positioned beneath the oak tree, then looked meaningfully at Kate. The message was clear: she was inviting Kate to sit, to take time to adjust to this unprecedented situation. Kate moved slowly to the bench, her legs feeling unsteady. Charlotte immediately settled beside her, chattering excitedly about finally being able to share her secret friend with someone who could see her too. The normality of Charlotte's reaction provided a strange comfort to her daughter. This was simply a wonderful moment of sharing something precious. As Kate sat quietly, trying to calm her racing heart and open her mind to possibilities she had never considered, Lady Margaret's voice began to reach her. It started as a whisper, like wind through leaves, but gradually became clearer until Kate could understand individual words and, then, complete sentences. Please don't be frightened, Lady Margaret was saying, her voice carrying the refined accent of her era.
I know this must be overwhelming for you.
It has been many decades since I've been able to communicate with an adult. Children are so much more open to unusual experiences. Kate felt tears prick her eyes. The voice was exactly what she had expected based on Lady Margaret's background: educated, cultured, and infinitely gentle. There was also a profound sadness underlying the words, the echo of someone who had been separated from the world she loved for far too long.
Why? Kate managed to ask. Why can I see you now when I couldn't before?
Lady Margaret moved closer, her form becoming slightly more solid as she did so.
Love, she said simply. Your love for Charlotte and your determination to understand what was happening to her created an opening in the barriers that usually separate my world from yours. When someone approaches with genuine care and an open heart, communication becomes possible. Charlotte looked back and forth between the two adults, her face glowing with happiness. Isn't this wonderful, Mama? Now you can learn all the amazing things Miss Margaret knows too.
Kate studied the ghostly governess more carefully. Lady Margaret's appearance was exactly as depicted in the historical photographs, but there were subtle differences that spoke of her supernatural nature. Her clothing, while period appropriate, seemed to shimmer with an inner light that no earthly fabric could produce. Her hair moved as if stirred by breezes that Kate couldn't feel, and her eyes held depths that suggested she had seen far more than any mortal woman of her age should have experienced.
How long have you been here?
Kate asked, her voice growing stronger as she adjusted to the impossible conversation. Since the night I died, Lady Margaret replied matter-of-factly.
September 15, 1929.
I was walking in these gardens, thinking about my students and planning lessons for the following week, when I suffered what your modern doctors would probably call a stroke. I remember falling, hitting my head on a stone, and then waking up to find that I was no longer entirely physical. The clinical way she described her own death was somehow more unsettling than if she had been emotional about it.
Kate realized that Lady Margaret had had nearly a century to come to terms with her situation. At first, Lady Margaret continued, I was confused and terrified. I tried to return to my duties, to contact the children I was responsible for, but no one could see or hear me. It took me some time to understand what had happened and, longer still, to learn how to interact with the physical world when circumstances permitted. Charlotte reached out and appeared to take Lady Margaret's hand, though Kate could see that her daughter's fingers passed through the ghostly form without making contact. Remarkably, Charlotte seemed unsurprised by this, as if she had grown accustomed to the limitations of interacting with a spirit. Miss Margaret can't touch things the way we can, Charlotte explained to Kate. But she can move small objects sometimes when she concentrates very hard. She showed me how she arranged those flowers on the memorial stone by focusing all her energy. Kate thought about the evidence Thompson had documented, the moved objects, the arranged flowers, the footprints that suggested physical presence. Apparently, Lady Margaret could occasionally manifest enough energy to affect the material world, though it clearly required significant effort. Why do you stay? Kate asked gently. What keeps you here instead of moving on to whatever comes next? Lady Margaret's expression grew wistful and deeply sad. Unfinished business, I suppose. My entire identity was built around caring for and educating children. When I died, I left behind students who needed me, lessons unfinished, potential unrealized. I couldn't bear the thought of abandoning them. She gestured toward Charlotte with obvious affection. Every few years, a child comes along who reminds me of my original purpose. Someone bright and curious and deserving of all the knowledge and love I have to offer. Each time, I hope that perhaps if I can complete what I started, if I can give one more child everything they need to flourish, I might finally find peace. Kate felt her heart break for this trapped soul who had spent nearly a century trying to fulfill her earthly duties from beyond the grave. The dedication and love that had driven Lady Margaret in life had become her prison in death. But Charlotte isn't your original student, Kate pointed out carefully. What happens when you've taught her everything you can? Will you finally be able to rest? Lady Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her translucent form flickering slightly as if the question had disturbed her concentration. I don't know, she admitted finally. I've never successfully completed a full education with any of the children I've encountered over the decades. Something always interrupts, parents become concerned, circumstances change, the children grow too old or move away. Charlotte is the first child I've been able to work with consistently for an extended period. Kate felt a chill of understanding. Lady Margaret's supernatural existence was tied to her educational mission, but she had never been able to complete that mission successfully. Charlotte might represent her first real opportunity in nearly a century to finish what she had started and find the peace that had eluded her for so long. What would completing Charlotte's education mean, exactly? Kate asked, though she suspected she might not like the answer. I would guide her intellectual and moral development until she reaches young adulthood, Lady Margaret explained. I would ensure she has all the knowledge, skills, and character traits necessary to fulfill her highest potential. In the old days, a governess's relationship with her charges continued until they were ready to take their place in adult society. Kate felt a surge of protective alarm. The idea of a supernatural entity guiding her daughter's development for the next decade or more was both fascinating and terrifying. What would be the long-term effects of such an arrangement? How would Charlotte develop normally while maintaining such an extraordinary relationship? I can see your concern, Lady Margaret said, apparently reading Kate's expression. Please understand that I would never do anything to harm Charlotte or interfere with your role as her mother. My influence would be purely educational and supportive. I've spent decades observing how the world has changed, learning about modern child development and educational philosophy. I would adapt my methods to support Charlotte's growth in your current era. Charlotte had been listening to this conversation with growing excitement. Mama, wouldn't that be wonderful? Miss Margaret could teach me everything about history and science and literature. She knows so many amazing things that aren't in regular books. Kate looked at her daughter's glowing face and felt the weight of an impossible decision. On one hand,
Charlotte was being offered an educational opportunity unlike anything available in the modern world, personal instruction from someone with nearly a century of accumulated knowledge and experience. On the other hand, the supernatural nature of the relationship raised questions that no parent should have to consider. "I need time to think about this," Kate said carefully. "This is all very new to me, and I want to make sure I understand the implications fully before making any decisions about Charlotte's future." Lady Margaret nodded with obvious understanding. "Of course. This is an extraordinary situation, and you're wise to consider it carefully. I've waited nearly a century. I can certainly wait a bit longer while you determine what's best for your daughter." "In the meantime," Kate said, "I'd like to understand more about what you've already taught Charlotte. Can you show me some of your educational methods?" Lady Margaret's face lit up with enthusiasm, reminding Kate that teaching had been this woman's greatest passion in life. "I would be delighted. Charlotte and I have been working on a project that combines history, botany, and archaeology. Would you like to see?" Charlotte jumped up from the bench eagerly. "Oh yes, Mama. Wait until you see what we discovered about the lost rose garden." Lady Margaret led them deeper into the heritage garden, moving with the gliding motion that Kate was beginning to recognize as characteristic of her supernatural state. They approached an area that Kate had always assumed was simply an unused section of the grounds, a somewhat overgrown space between the formal garden beds and the memorial area. "This section has been neglected for decades," Lady Margaret explained, "but it was once one of the most beautiful parts of the palace gardens. In the 1890s, Queen Victoria commissioned a special rose garden here to commemorate her late husband. It featured rare varieties from around the world, many of which were lost when the garden was abandoned during World War I. Charlotte began pointing out subtle features that Kate had never noticed before: barely visible stone edging that outlined the original flower beds, remnants of decorative ironwork hidden beneath decades of ivy growth, and what appeared to be the foundation of a small gazebo or garden house. "Miss Margaret taught me how to look for clues about what used to be here," Charlotte explained enthusiastically. "We've been mapping the original garden layout and identifying plants that might be descendants of the original varieties." Kate was amazed by the sophistication of this project. Lady Margaret was teaching Charlotte advanced concepts in historical research, botanical identification, and archaeological methodology, all through hands-on discovery that kept her daughter thoroughly engaged. "We've also been researching the historical records," Lady Margaret added. "I've been guiding Charlotte through the process of finding and interpreting primary source documents. She's become quite skilled at reading Victorian-era handwriting and understanding the context of historical correspondence." Kate thought about Charlotte's recent improvements in reading comprehension and her newfound interest in historical topics. These weren't random developments, they were the result of intensive, personalized instruction from someone with extraordinary expertise. As they explored the hidden garden, Lady Margaret demonstrated her teaching methods by asking Charlotte questions that encouraged critical thinking and independent analysis. Rather than simply providing information, she guided Charlotte to draw her own conclusions based on evidence and logical reasoning. "Charlotte," Lady Margaret said, "what do you think happened to the original roses when the garden was abandoned?" Charlotte studied the overgrown area thoughtfully. "Some of them probably died without proper care," she said slowly. "But roses are hardy plants, so some might have survived and gone wild. If we look carefully, we might find descendants of the original varieties growing among the weeds." "Excellent reasoning," Lady Margaret praised. "And how might we determine if a wild rose is descended from one of the original commemorative varieties?" "We could compare them to descriptions in the historical records," Charlotte replied confidently. "And we could look for characteristics that would be unusual in common garden roses, unusual colors, distinctive petal patterns, or special fragrances." Kate was impressed by the quality of critical thinking Charlotte was displaying. These weren't memorized answers, her daughter was genuinely learning to analyze evidence and draw logical conclusions. As the afternoon progressed, Lady Margaret demonstrated several other educational activities she had developed for Charlotte. They included nature journaling that combined artistic observation with scientific recording, storytelling exercises that encouraged Charlotte to research and retell historical events from multiple perspectives, and mathematical games that used garden measurements and plant populations to teach advanced concepts. Every activity was designed to be engaging and age-appropriate while challenging Charlotte to think more deeply and critically than typical educational approaches would require. Kate began to understand why Charlotte had been showing such remarkable intellectual growth. She was receiving the equivalent of a graduate-level tutorial from someone with unlimited time, patience, and expertise. As the sun began to set and their garden visit drew to a close, Kate found herself facing the most difficult decision of her parenting experience. Lady Margaret Ashworth was offering Charlotte an educational opportunity that was literally irreplaceable, knowledge and guidance from someone who had devoted her entire existence, both mortal and supernatural, to the development of young minds. Yet the supernatural nature of the relationship raised concerns that Kate couldn't ignore. What would be the psychological effects on Charlotte of maintaining such an intimate relationship with a ghostly figure? How would she relate to other children and adults as she grew older? Would she be able to form normal relationships, or would she always be seeking connections that matched the extraordinary nature of her friendship with Lady Margaret? "I can see you wrestling with difficult questions," Lady Margaret said gently as they prepared to leave the garden. "Perhaps it would help if you spoke with some of the other children I've worked with over the years. Several of them are still living and have gone on to lead remarkable lives." Kate felt a spark of hope. If she could speak with adults who had experienced similar supernatural education as children, she might be able to better understand the long-term implications of allowing Charlotte's relationship with Lady Margaret to continue. "That would be very helpful," Kate said. "Could you arrange such meetings?" Lady Margaret smiled. "I believe I can guide you toward the right people. There's a professor of medieval history at Oxford who I worked with in the 1960s, and a renowned botanist who encountered me in the 1980s. Both have published extensively about their childhood experiences, though they presented them as inspiration rather than literal truth." Kate felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Within days, she might have answers that would help her determine the best path forward for Charlotte. Until then, she would have to trust her instincts and hope that the extraordinary friendship blossoming in the palace gardens would ultimately prove to be a blessing rather than a burden. As they walked back toward the palace, Charlotte chattering happily about all the things she wanted to show Kate during their next garden visit, Kate realized that her life had been permanently changed by this encounter. She could never again pretend that the world was limited to what science and reason could easily explain. There were mysteries and possibilities that existed beyond conventional understanding, and her daughter had somehow become a bridge between worlds that most people never dreamed could touch. The question now was how to navigate this extraordinary situation with wisdom, courage, and love, protecting Charlotte while allowing her to benefit from opportunities that no other child in history had ever been offered. #Kate insists on reading the Guards Report, Part 5. 2 weeks after her first direct encounter with Lady Margaret, Kate found herself sitting in the study of Professor Elizabeth Hartwell at Oxford University, surrounded by towering bookshelves filled with medieval manuscripts and historical texts. The elderly woman across from her had agreed to this meeting after Kate had mentioned her interest in unusual childhood educational experiences, though Kate suspected the professor knew more about the true nature of their discussion than she was letting on. Professor Hartwell was a distinguished woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and intelligent eyes that seemed to hold decades of carefully guarded secrets. Her office was cluttered with the organized chaos of a lifetime devoted to academic research, but Kate noticed several items that seemed oddly out of place: pressed flowers in antique frames, Victorian-era children's books, and what appeared to be hand-drawn maps of garden layouts. "You mentioned on the telephone that you're researching historical educational methods used in palace settings," Professor Hartwell began carefully, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who had spent her career in academic circles. "Might I ask what sparked this particular interest?" Kate had rehearsed this conversation numerous times, trying to find a way to discuss the supernatural without sounding completely insane. "My daughter has been showing remarkable intellectual development recently, and I've become curious about some of the more innovative approaches used by governesses in the past. I understand you had some unique educational experiences as a child." Professor Hartwell's expression grew more guarded, and she studied Kate with obvious calculation. "Unique is certainly one way to describe them," she said finally. "What exactly has your daughter experienced that makes you think historical governessing methods might be relevant?" Kate decided to take a risk. She's been spending time in palace gardens with someone who teaches using methods that seem remarkably advanced for her age. Someone who demonstrates knowledge of historical events and natural science that goes far beyond what any ordinary person should possess. The professor's eyes widened slightly, and Kate saw recognition flicker across her features. For several long moments, the two women looked at each other in silence, each trying to determine how much the other knew about the impossible. "How old is your daughter?" Professor Hartwell asked quietly. 7. "And, these garden encounters, do they involve someone who isn't always entirely visible to other adults?" Kate felt her heart leap. Professor Hartwell clearly understood exactly what she was describing. "Yes. Someone who appears to be from an earlier era, who demonstrates knowledge and teaching abilities that seem to transcend normal human limitations." Professor Hartwell stood and walked to the window overlooking the Oxford courtyard, her hands clasped behind her back. When she turned back to Kate, her expression had transformed from guarded caution to something approaching relief. "I was 8 when I first met her," the professor said softly. "It was 1962, and I was staying at the palace with my family. My father was working on some historical restoration project. I was a lonely, bookish child who preferred the company of books to other children. She found me crying in the rose garden because I felt so out of place among all the formal events and adult conversations." Kate leaned forward, fascinated. "What was she like?" "Magical," Professor Hartwell replied without hesitation. "She appeared when I needed her most, offering friendship and intellectual stimulation that I couldn't find anywhere else. She taught me that learning could be an adventure, that history was filled with real people who had faced challenges just like mine." The professor moved to a bookshelf and pulled out a leather-bound journal. "I kept detailed records of our conversations and lessons. At the time, I thought she was simply a wonderful teacher who had somehow gained access to the palace grounds. It wasn't until years later that I began to suspect the truth about her nature." She opened the journal and showed Kate pages covered in a child's careful handwriting, interspersed with pressed flowers, sketched maps, and what appeared to be copies of historical documents. The level of detail and sophistication was remarkable for such a young child. "She taught me to think critically about historical sources, to question accepted narratives, and to look for evidence that others had overlooked," Professor Hartwell continued. "More importantly, she taught me that intellectual curiosity was a gift to be treasured, not something to be ashamed of." Kate studied the journal entries, noting the same educational approaches that Lady Margaret was using with Charlotte. "How long did your lessons continue?" 3 summers, Professor Hartwell replied. "Each year when my family returned to the palace, she was there waiting for me. Our lessons became increasingly sophisticated as I grew older. By the final summer, she was guiding me through original research projects that formed the foundation for my eventual academic career." "What happened after that?" Professor Hartwell's expression grew wistful. "My family's connection to the palace ended, and we stopped making summer visits. I never saw her again, though I've thought about her every day for over 50 years. She shaped not just my intellectual development, but my entire approach to life and learning." Kate felt both encouraged and concerned by this account. The positive long-term effects on Professor Hartwell were undeniable, but Kate noticed that the woman seemed to carry a sense of loss about the ended relationship. "Did you ever experience any negative effects from these encounters?" Kate asked. "Difficulty relating to other people, confusion about reality, psychological problems of any kind?" Professor Hartwell considered the question carefully. "Quite the opposite, actually. She taught me skills that served me well throughout my life: critical thinking, research methodology, confidence in my own intellectual abilities. If anything, I was better prepared for academic success than most of my peers." She paused and looked directly at Kate. "But I did struggle with relationships for many years. Not because of psychological damage, but because I had experienced such extraordinary intellectual intimacy with someone who understood me completely. Ordinary friendships and even romantic relationships seemed pale by comparison." This was exactly what Kate had feared. If Charlotte developed such a deep connection with Lady Margaret, would she ever be satisfied with normal human relationships? However, Professor Hartwell continued, I eventually realized that my experience with her had taught me what to look for in other relationships: intellectual compatibility, genuine understanding, shared curiosity about the world. When I did find friends and, eventually, a husband who shared those qualities, our connections were deeper and more meaningful than they might have been otherwise. Kate felt some relief at this perspective, but she still had concerns about the long-term implications.
Do you think children should be encouraged to continue such relationships, assuming they're genuine?
Professor Hartwell was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the centuries-old buildings that housed Oxford's accumulated knowledge.
That's a question I've wrestled with for decades, she admitted finally. On one hand, the educational benefits are extraordinary.
On the other hand, there are aspects of such relationships that challenge our understanding of reality in ways that can be difficult to navigate. She returned to her desk and pulled out another item, a faded photograph that appeared to show a young girl standing in a garden, apparently alone, though there was a strange distortion in the air beside her that suggested another presence. I had my father take this picture during our final summer together, Professor Hartwell explained. I wanted some proof of our friendship, though I knew others couldn't see her clearly.
Look carefully at the shadow patterns.
Kate studied the photograph and could see what appeared to be a second shadow cast by someone who wasn't visible in the frame. The evidence was subtle but unmistakable. My advice, Professor Hartwell continued, is to allow the relationship to continue while maintaining careful observation. Document everything, ensure your daughter maintains connections with children her own age, and be prepared to intervene if you notice any signs of unhealthy dependence or reality distortion. But, most importantly, she added, leaning forward with obvious intensity, don't let fear of the unusual deprive your daughter of something that could transform her life in positive ways. I've spent 50 years grateful for those 3 summers, despite the challenges they created. Kate left Oxford with mixed feelings but greater clarity about her situation. Professor Hartwell's account had confirmed that Lady Margaret's educational influence could have profoundly positive long-term effects, but it had also highlighted potential complications that Kate would need to monitor carefully. Over the following days, Kate arranged to meet with Dr. James Morrison, the renowned botanist that Lady Margaret had mentioned. His story proved remarkably similar to Professor Hartwell's: extraordinary childhood encounters that had shaped his academic career and worldview, followed by a lifetime of grateful reflection on the experience. Dr. Morrison had encountered Lady Margaret during the summer of 1987, when he was 9 years old and staying at the palace while his mother worked on a documentary about royal gardens. His account of their botanical explorations matched Charlotte's descriptions perfectly, and his adult expertise in plant biology clearly stemmed from those early supernatural lessons. She taught me to see patterns in nature that most people miss, Dr. Morrison explained during their meeting at the Royal Botanical Gardens. Not just the obvious connections between plants and their environments, but deeper relationships that reveal the underlying structure of ecological systems. Like Professor Hartwell, he had gone on to achieve remarkable success in his field, publishing groundbreaking research that had earned him international recognition. Both individuals credited their childhood encounters with Lady Margaret as the foundation for their professional achievements. Armed with these accounts, Kate felt more confident about allowing Charlotte's relationship with Lady Margaret to continue, but she established careful guidelines. Charlotte would maintain her regular social activities and friendships with children her own age. The garden encounters would be limited to specific times and always under discreet surveillance. Most importantly, Kate would have regular conversations with Charlotte to monitor her psychological well-being and ensure she maintained a healthy perspective on the unusual nature of her friendship. As autumn progressed, Kate observed Charlotte's continued growth with amazement and pride. Her daughter's intellectual development accelerated dramatically, but she remained emotionally balanced and socially engaged with her peers. The supernatural education seemed to be enhancing rather than replacing Charlotte's normal childhood experiences. Lady Margaret proved to be a remarkably sophisticated educator who adapted her methods to support Charlotte's overall development rather than creating dependence. She encouraged Charlotte to share her learning with other children, to apply her new knowledge in regular school settings, and to maintain curiosity about subjects beyond their garden lessons. Most remarkably, Lady Margaret began working toward what she called her completion goal, preparing Charlotte to eventually continue learning independently while maintaining the critical thinking skills and love of knowledge that their supernatural relationship had fostered. My role, Lady Margaret explained during one of their garden conversations, is to give Charlotte the tools she needs to become a lifelong learner. Once she has those tools and the confidence to use them, she won't need my direct guidance anymore. Kate realized that Lady Margaret was actively working toward ending her own earthly presence by successfully completing the educational mission that had kept her bound to the palace gardens for nearly a century. Rather than seeking to maintain eternal influence over Charlotte, the ghostly governess was preparing her student for intellectual independence. The thought of Lady Margaret finally finding peace after so many decades of supernatural existence was both beautiful and sad. Kate had grown to appreciate the remarkable woman who had devoted her entire being, both mortal and eternal, to nurturing young minds. As winter approached and the garden encounters continued, Kate noticed subtle changes in Lady Margaret's appearance. The ghostly governess seemed slightly more translucent than before, as if her connection to the physical world was gradually weakening. When Kate mentioned this observation, Lady Margaret smiled with obvious satisfaction. "I can feel it happening," she said softly. "For the first time in nearly a century, I sense that my work here may actually be approaching completion. Charlotte is developing exactly as I had hoped. She's gaining not just knowledge, but the wisdom to use that knowledge well." Charlotte seemed to understand intuitively that their extraordinary friendship was temporary. Rather than clinging to Lady Margaret or showing signs of separation anxiety, she threw herself into learning with even greater enthusiasm, as if determined to absorb everything possible before their time together ended. "Miss Margaret says I'm going to be ready to be my own teacher soon," Charlotte told Kate one evening. "She's been showing me how to find answers to questions even when there's no one around to ask. It's like having a treasure hunt in my brain." As Kate tucked Charlotte into bed that night, she reflected on the remarkable journey they had all taken together. What had started as a frightening mystery had evolved into an extraordinary educational opportunity that would shape Charlotte's entire life. Lady Margaret Ashworth, the devoted governess who had died tragically in 1929, was finally completing her most important lesson, teaching a child not just what to learn, but how to keep learning long after the teacher was gone. The supernatural presence that had initially terrified Kate had become a cherished part of their family's story, a bridge between past and present that had enriched their lives in ways she could never have imagined. As Charlotte drifted off to sleep, Kate knew that whatever happened next, her daughter had been given the rarest of gifts, an education rooted in love, wisdom, and the unshakable belief that learning was life's greatest adventure. In the gardens outside, Lady Margaret Ashworth continued her patient vigil, preparing for the day when her century-long mission would finally be complete and she could rest at last, knowing that she had given one more child everything she needed to flourish in a world full of infinite possibilities.